Fort Braddock was not just a military base, it was a monument to tradition. Every brick, every drill, and every salute carried the weight of history. For decades, it had produced warriors who lived by the iron rule of obedience and command. In such a place, authority was not questioned, it flowed downward like a chain of steel. Soldiers were trained to follow orders without hesitation, to respect rank above all else, and to endure the harshness of command as part of their duty. But the same tradition that forged discipline also created an environment where fear thrived, and abuse could hide behind the mask of authority. It was into this atmosphere that Captain Alina Torres stepped, and her very presence began to challenge the old order. Alina Torres was not the tallest officer, nor did she wear her accomplishments as decorations to be flaunted. Yet when she entered a room, seasoned soldiers stood straighter. She did not lead by instilling fear, she led by earning respect. Her power was not in her voice, but in her character. She carried the kind of calm authority that did not need to announce itself. It was simply felt. Where tradition demanded obedience, she inspired loyalty. Where authority insisted on silence, she encouraged competence. Her leadership was a quiet defiance to the old ways, and even without confrontation, it made the rigid walls of Fort Braddock tremble. Tradition, however, is a stubborn force. Colonel Briggs embodied everything Fort Braddock had stood for in its harsher sense. He ruled with intimidation, seeing leadership as control and respect as submission. To him, discipline meant domination, and his presence was maintained through fear. His authority was the kind that silenced voices, that dismissed competence if it threatened his command. And yet, in the same space, stood Captain Torres, a woman whose strength was not in fear, but in integrity. This clash, between tradition misused and leadership rightly earned, was inevitable. One represented the past, the other symbolized the future. What made Torres stand apart was not just her record of service or the medals she had earned in silence, but the way she carried her principles into every interaction. She believed discipline was not about humiliation, but about responsibility. She believed leadership was not about reminding others of rank, but about standing beside them in the dirt and sweat of daily struggle. When soldiers saw her training with them, running with them, and enduring with them, they recognized something rare: a leader who lived the values she demanded. Against the backdrop of Fort Braddock's traditions, her presence became a mirror, reflecting what leadership could be if built on respect rather than fear. In the end, the weight of tradition and the presence of true leadership collided at Fort Braddock. Torres did not challenge the institution itself. She honored its values of duty, sacrifice, and discipline. But she challenged the corruption of those values when twisted by men like Briggs. She showed that leadership does not need to be loud to be strong, and it does not need to crush others to prove authority. Her very presence became a silent revolution, and while tradition had long held Fort Braddock in chains, her leadership revealed a deeper truth: discipline without humanity is tyranny, but discipline with integrity becomes strength. That truth was the beginning of everything that followed. Power in the wrong hands is like a weapon turned inward. It harms not only the people it touches, but the very institution it is meant to protect. At Fort Braddock, Colonel Everett Briggs had turned command into personal dominion. Decorated from past wars, he was once admired, but years of unchecked authority had corroded that respect into fear. To Briggs, leadership was not about guiding soldiers, it was about bending them. He believed in control more than care, in punishment more than progress. In meetings, he cut down ideas with sharp words. In drills, he used humiliation as a tool of discipline. He was not respected for his character, but tolerated because of his rank. This was not command presence. It was abuse disguised as tradition. From the moment Captain Alina Torres arrived, she became a target of this abuse. Her competence threatened his ego, Her calm authority exposed his bluster, and her very presence reminded others that leadership could be different. Briggs responded the only way men drunk on power know how, by undermining her. He interrupted her in briefings with condescending remarks. He dismissed her carefully crafted reports as overthinking. He reissued her orders under his own name, attempting to strip her of recognition. These were not acts of guidance, they were strikes of erosion. Each one was meant to weaken her standing, to make her doubt herself, and to show others that no matter her rank, she stood beneath him. But power abused never hides for long. The whispers began, rumors of inappropriate remarks, female officers transferred without explanation, and complaints buried before they reached the light. Briggs had allies in high places, but his behavior left scars across the base. Torres noticed the glances, the quiet warnings, the anonymous notes slipped under her door. Be careful. He's watching you closer than the others. These signs revealed a deeper sickness, abuse that had been tolerated so long it had become part of the system. The seeds of conflict were already planted, and Briggs's ego made sure they would grow. For Torres, the choice was not simple. She could speak out too soon and risk being silenced. Like those before her, she could endure in silence as tradition demanded, but abuse of power has a way of tightening its grip until endurance is no longer survival, it becomes submission. Every dismissive remark, every strategic obstruction, and every attempt to bypass her authority was not just an insult. It was an attack on the very values she had sworn to protect. It was in these moments that she realized the conflict was not between her and one man, but between integrity and corruption, between leadership and tyranny. And so the tension thickened, a storm forming in silence. Briggs believed he could continue unchecked, that fear would keep his soldiers quiet, and his rank would shield him from consequences. But abuse has a limit. It always plants the seed of its own downfall. By trying to diminish Torres, Briggs unknowingly gave her the ground to stand taller. Every attempt to silence her only amplified the respect her soldiers felt. Every injustice against her only sharpened her resolve. The seeds of conflict had been sown not by Torres's defiance, but by Briggs's abuse. All that remained was the inevitable moment when those seeds would break through the surface, and silence would no longer be an option. For weeks, Captain Elena Torres endured Colonel Briggs's games in silence. She had seen the military's shadows before, where speaking too soon could end a career, and silence was often the only shield against injustice. Every insult, every obstruction, every attempt to undermine her authority, she absorbed with the discipline of a soldier who knew timing mattered. To some, her silence looked like submission. But to her soldiers, it was something different. They saw restraint, not weakness. They saw a leader who understood that battles are not always fought with rifles. Sometimes they are fought with patience. Yet silence cannot last forever. The cracks were widening. Briggs escalated from subtle sabotage to open humiliation, targeting Torres in meetings, denying her unit's requests, and staging grueling drills to break her squad. But what he failed to see was that her silence was never surrender. It was preparation. Each time he tried to push her down, her soldiers watched her rise again with quiet resilience. Loyalty grew in the hearts of her unit, not because she demanded it, but because she stood beside them, training, sweating, and enduring the same hardships they faced. Silent endurance was forging something powerful, respect that no amount of bullying could erase. The breaking point came not in the shadows but under the open sky, before the eyes of 282 soldiers. During a live drill, Torres gave a perfectly standard command to adjust formation, but Briggs saw it as an opportunity. He stormed across the field, shouting in front of the entire division, questioning her authority. She stood calm, her voice steady, citing protocol. But Briggs didn't want protocol. He wanted dominance. And then, In a moment that revealed everything, he raised his hand to strike her. The air froze. The silence was heavy. This was the moment her patience had been leading toward. Torres did not react with fear or hesitation. Years of training, discipline, and control surged into action. With precise movement, she intercepted his strike, turned his force against him, and in one swift motion, broke his arm. The crack echoed across the parade ground like a gunshot, shattering not only bone, but the silence that had held the base captive for years. For the first time, every soldier saw the truth. She had not escalated the conflict. He had. Her defiance was not an act of rebellion, but of survival, of discipline, of standing firm when injustice crossed the line. That single act transformed everything. Torres's silent endurance ended in a moment of open defiance that no one could ignore. She had held her ground with restraint until the very second it mattered most. And when she finally acted, it was not with rage, but with control. She did not humiliate Briggs, he humiliated himself. She simply refused to bow. In that instant, before the eyes of hundreds, Alina Torres proved that silence has its limits, and when those limits are crossed, true leadership does not back down. It stands tall. When the dust settled on the parade ground, and Colonel Briggs was carried away with a broken arm, the silence that followed was unlike any Fort Braddock had known. It was not the silence of fear, but of realization. Every soldier present had witnessed the truth with their own eyes. A superior officer had crossed a line, and Captain Alina Torres had refused to yield. In that moment, her act was more than self-defense. It was defiance against a culture of intimidation. Soldiers whispered to one another in disbelief, not about the fracture of bone, but about the fracture of silence. She had done what many wished they could have done, and by doing so, she gave them permission to find their voices. The whispers grew quickly into something larger. Anonymous notes turned into formal complaints. The stories of harassment, threats, and buried reports began to surface from soldiers who had once remained silent out of fear of retaliation. For years, Colonel Briggs had thrived on the assumption that no one would dare stand against him. But Torres's stand shifted the balance. What had once been unspoken now surged forward like a dam breaking. Her single act of resistance became the spark that lit an entire movement within the base, proving that courage is contagious. As testimonies poured in, Torres herself transformed in the eyes of those around her. She was no longer just Captain Torres, a competent officer with discipline and clarity. She became a living symbol of resistance, integrity, and justice. Soldiers who had endured quietly now saw in her a reflection of their own buried struggles. She showed them that standing against abuse was possible, even within a system built on hierarchy and command. And once a symbol is born, it cannot easily be contained. Her name traveled beyond Fort Braddock, whispered in mess halls, passed along in private networks, and eventually spoken in the halls of higher command. But becoming a symbol carried its own weight. Torres had not sought glory. She had acted out of necessity. Yet now she found herself at the center of something larger than personal survival. To some, she was a hero. To others, a threat. Soldiers saluted her with a newfound reverence, while powerful figures in the chain of command sought ways to minimize her influence. The base was no longer divided by rank but by conscience. Those who valued justice stood with her, and those who clung to old ways stood against her. This was the ripple effect. Her defiance was no longer her own. It belonged to everyone who had once been silent. And so, the soldier became a symbol. The act that began as a moment of defense had transformed into a rallying point for change. Torres's courage had not only protected her dignity, it had awakened the dignity of others. The ripple effect of her defiance spread through every corner of Fort Braddock, through the wider military, and eventually into the public eye. Her story proved that sometimes one act, in one instant, can carry the weight of a movement. And from that moment forward, Captain Alina Torres was no longer just a leader. She was the embodiment of a truth long ignored, that even in the most rigid of systems, integrity can rise and courage can reshape the future. Justice in the military is often slow, heavy, and hidden behind closed doors. But after the confrontation at Fort Braddock, hiding was no longer possible. The image of a colonel raising his hand in anger and being stopped by a captain had already spread far beyond the drill yard. Soldiers talked, officers whispered, anonymous testimonies flooded in. By the time investigators arrived, they were not dealing with a single incident. They were facing years of buried abuse that could no longer be denied. Colonel Briggs, once feared as untouchable, was suddenly stripped of his armor of silence. The system that had protected him for years began to unravel. The hearings that followed were not only about a broken arm, they were about a broken culture. Testimony after testimony painted the picture of a man who had twisted authority into tyranny and of a base that had allowed fear to take root. Against this backdrop, Captain Alina Torres stood not as an aggressor, but as a defender of discipline itself. Her actions, once questioned as insubordination, were now seen as an act of survival and leadership. The panel of generals could not ignore what had become undeniable: justice was overdue. And when the verdict was delivered, Briggs stripped of command, dishonorably discharged, and brought to trial, it was more than the fall of a man. It was the fall of a culture of silence. For Torres, justice did not come with celebration, but with transformation. She had not sought to become the face of a movement, yet her stand reshaped her destiny. The army could not bury her. Instead, it was forced to recognize her. She was honored for her courage, promoted for her integrity, and entrusted with responsibilities that reached beyond Fort Braddock. What began as a personal defense became a public acknowledgement that leadership is not defined by rank alone, but by moral strength. She became a symbol not only of resistance but of renewal, proof that even within rigid systems, change is possible when someone has the courage to act. The transformation was not only hers, it spread across the institution. Soldiers walked taller, spoke more freely, and trusted that their voices might finally matter. Bases across the country began to question their own silence, as whispers turned into policies and investigations. Alina Torres's act of courage had rippled outward, forcing the military to confront its reflection. It was no longer just about one captain and one colonel. It was about accountability, dignity, and the kind of culture that future soldiers would inherit. The beginning of reform was fragile, but it was real. And so, what seemed like an ending was, in truth, a beginning. Torres's journey was not about revenge, but about drawing a line that could not be crossed. She showed that justice is not about punishing the guilty alone. It is about protecting the future. Her story became a reminder that leadership rooted in integrity can reshape even the most unyielding traditions. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a path had been cleared for transformation. And with that transformation came a new beginning, not only for Captain Alina Torres, but for every soldier who now believed that silence could be broken and that dignity could, at last, stand unshaken.